преддверие премудростью вон мемом.
Good afternoon, welcome to Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting.ca, and I have two special guests with me today. Of course, most of you by now know Professor Dart. Ron and I do a lot of work together. Ron Dart is professor at the University of the Fraser Valley, and anyway a specialist in Canadian politics or philosophy of Canadian politics. One of the I would say the foremost Canadian philosopher of the Red Tory tradition in our era, and something of a direct descendant of George Grant. So we're going to be talking and with newly ordained or recently ordained Anglican priest Dionysi, or do I call you Dionysius?
You can call me by my Greek name Dionysius, by my
Dionysius.
Irish name Denis.
Denis Scully. And we're going to be discussing really secularism and the sacred, and trying to look at why essentially in a democratic society one has to have a secular state, but at the same time to re-emphasize that Canada is not a secular society. The society isn't divorced from religion or from faith. The government, to the best degree possible, really has to be kept out of religion because it can't represent all religions, it can only represent one. And if it represented the one, it would be very often to the detriment of the others. So we're going to try to discuss it a little bit. And I have a saying that when you dance with Caesar, Caesar always leads. And that's a kind of concept. And I'm going to ask Ron Dart to say a little bit about why Canadian society really is not secular, even though we have a secular government as do most democratic societies. Ron, would you lead us into, the Canadian society is not essentially secular.
Yeah, I think your initial distinction is very important between state and society. And it's one thing to say the state or a party in power does not adhere or support to one religious tradition or one tradition within a religious tradition as the dominant way of determining domestic and foreign policy. It's quite another thing to say the society we live in is not religious or does not have a sacred tendencies. I think we discover in Canadian society, and even in the language of multiculturalism, pluralism, diversity, there's two tendencies at work. There's the secular prejudices side, which says we have to keep religion, spirituality at arm's length. It's problematic, and if people get too religious or go too far down the spiritual road, there's violence, there's confrontation, there's division. And so that's one element of sort of secularism when it confronts multiculturalism, diversity, pluralism. This tradition. The other, within the what we call the more centrist liberal tradition, is say, how can you claim to talk about multiculturalism, pluralism, tolerance, diversity, and marginalized religion? Because people who come from different religious and historic and cultural and ethnic backgrounds are religious. And so Canada is peopled by nations, people coming from different parts of the world who still maintain their distinct religious backgrounds. And so, on the one hand, when we say Canadian society is sacred in many ways, religious, that's very important to maintain and support. To take the next step and say one particular form of religion should be the dominant one at the level of state, that becomes problematic. But on the other hand, I would also say that to negate the role of MPs, MLAs who come from religious backgrounds, when they take power at a provincial or federal level, and they have to separate themselves from their sacred commitments and become secular, that's to hive a person's mind and spirit off. It's just knowing how to be tolerant of one another when they're making serious decisions at domestic and foreign policy levels.
Yeah. I think that's important too. It's significant that in Canada, unlike in the United States, we have no provision in the Constitution for the separation of church and state, whereas the United States does. And it never crossed people's minds during the foundations of Canada, because it was rather presumed that Canada was going to continue to be a basically religious society. And the only issue I think that was raised was that the government itself shouldn't espouse one or another religion and advocate it to the detriment of any others. Of course, when people are in Parliament, their decisions are going to be shaped by their religious background, by their spiritual essence, by their spiritual formation. And that's necessary. The extreme secularism of the state is really where the state desires to secularize society. And that we've seen a couple of examples of that in the last century. And so this question of what is secularism actually when we talk about government, and what is spirituality actually when we talk about society, and how do we kind of define the two. The very foundation stone, the rock upon which all morality is built, is evolutionary. And it comes from the development of group selection. The rock upon which all moral concepts are based are the two evolutionary ones of fairness and empathy. That's the very foundation. That's usually carried on in the teachings of religion, in spite of the fact that sometimes religion negates both of them with all kinds of laws and regulations. But those are the very foundation stones of morality itself and what morality consists in. And for the government then to choose one set of moral concepts against another, for example, you can't really compare moral concepts which require a woman to marry her rapist, or which allow a man to cut off his wife's nose. Although these are religious principles, you can't really think that the government should step back and allow those. So there obviously have to be some controls within the framework of other religious and what is considered to be moral. One thinks of the 14-year-old girl in Pakistan who was assassinated. Fortunately, she didn't die. But her desire to know how to read and write were classed by her religion as gross immorality. Gross immorality for women to know how to read and write. Obviously, the state has to be able to take secular decisions when it's faced with this aspect of religion.
I was going to say the two dangers that you have to avoid on both sides is society trying to sacralize the state, or a state trying to secularize society. And somewhere in between there is the meeting, the dialogue, the engagement, which honors both the best of secularism, and at its best, it's not the negation of religion, it attempts to pluralize religion in the sense that both and all religions have to hear and heed and honor one another.
One of the things that I've found, I spent, as you know, 25 years policing, 8 years with a federal police force and 17 years with a city police force. And I found that in my experience within government circles, it was amazing how this idea, one thing I'm kind of hearing a little bit from you, Ron, is this idea of liberalism, that I found that this idea of liberalism in many regards, on a very personal note, and when I watched it around the workplace, wasn't really as liberal as what it oftentimes would say it is. And commonly, they wanted to embrace, for example, all faiths, all religions, and that nobody should be, preaching or enforcing one kind of religious way or anything like that. So it's like to become a-religious, non-religious, and especially increasingly, in my personal experience during those 25 years, was that you couldn't be Christian in any way, shape, or form. Not as explicitly and openly in terms of just simply living or believing and practicing certain things, but you could be other religions. And that's the other thing. So it's this, I would say, the liberalism and the distorted view of what liberalism has become in many regards. And the second thing is how oftentimes people who are Christian are discriminated against, whereas other beliefs and other faith perspectives are not. And that's something I've seen happen very personally in my experience in Canada here.
I think what we have, and I think the point you're making is absolutely spot on, is there is a form of inconsistent liberalism at work in our society. And there are reasons for that. One is because in the West, Christianity has tended to be the dominant religion, and so some of the best forms of it have come out, but also some of the worst forms. And so people have right before their eyes the distortions of Christianity, and they'll tend to pick on the negative, and they'll say that's what Christianity is like. Whereas they have usually often very highly romanticized or idealized view of another religion, so they see one all good,
Right.
and they see Christianity as negative. And so there's this explicit, as you mentioned, often critique of Christianity, and its voice should be muted. Whereas, First Nations, Sikh, the Dalai Lama, you can go on with these. Oh yes, religion is very important, and so in that sense, it's a form of inconsistent liberalism, and it borders at times on liberal fundamentalism.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think sometimes the term liberal is not understood or misused, because you can have people who are very profoundly believers who are quite liberal in most respects of their lives and politics. So it seems to me that there's a kind of either pantheism or a religion rather than liberalism.
Well, there's an unhealthy liberalism as well. I mean, I think that, I'm not sure if...
Yeah, I'm just not comfortable with liberalism as being the definition of that. I realize that liberalism in the 19th century sponsored laissez-faire, complete hands off of everything, and no regulations on anything. But that was in the economic sphere.
Right.
But you can find people who are liberals in every respect, but profoundly conservative about their religion.
Right.
And I think there's some other dynamic going on that needs to be looked at sometimes. And there is, and perhaps New Age describes it as well as anything, that it's, I know some very, very conservative people who are radical atheists. And consequently, liberal conservative doesn't really define anything anymore. And we'll probably touch on that when we talk about Victorianism. But there's something else going on that we need to look at. Women were not required by Muhammad to wear veils or burqas. Wearing a veil started with his youngest wife, Aisha, who was actually a warlord. She led the Battle of the Red Camel against, up in Iraq. And she wore a veil just because she thought she was too beautiful for common men to look upon. She was very humble. But really she started the custom of wearing the veil, in a way. And I often wonder if, after reading about that gang rape where the girl was killed in India, if women didn't invent burqas, self-defense against men sometimes. But it was not a requirement of Muhammad. He never has any such requirement. That all came later on, and that's some of the things in religion come later on.
I think to return to Denis's point, which I think is an interesting one, is that if we are going to argue that Canadian society has a distinctive religious and sacred content to it, and there are different cultures that come from different religious traditions, and yet in reality there often is this implicit and often explicit criticism of Christianity, but an openness to all other religions. And you have the language on the one hand of pluralism, multiculturalism, diversity, all of this sort of cliches of liberalism, and yet when it comes to certain religions, often certain forms of Islam because of 9/11 or things going on in the Middle East, or Christianity, there's often a tendency to say, well, that religion you can't talk about publicly, and so it's one thing to say Canadian society does have this religious component to it, but there is at work a culture wars going on by which some religions it's acceptable, it's supported to talk about them, but others it's sort of taboo, and that's something that has to be done because it is an inconsistent liberalism,
right.
and I think anyone who's engaged publicly or in society will experience, and it's part of the a reaction to picking on selective elements of the Christian tradition in the West and not seeing all the good that the Christian tradition has.
Something else I might add to that too, Lydia, you brought up that we don't have a legalized separation between church and state, and yet in very practical senses, what I personally experienced and what I've seen academically as well and politically is that there is a certain assumption or adoption amongst some within our Canadian society and political realm that would assume that we do have a separation of church and state. I've had many discussions with colleagues and others who talk about separation of church and state, and I've had to remind them that we do not have technically we do not have a legal separation between church and state. And it's interesting because this is what George Grant talked about in terms of the American colonization through its technology and through its dominance in the world, that we've almost in Canada come to think, some have come to think, that we are what the American people and law is. We're not in Canada.
Well, yeah, that's why a lot of Canadians think we elect a prime minister, but we don't. He's not on any ballot except the one in his own riding.
Right.
And our Canadians have very little understanding of the Canadian governmental system. That's part of it. But I think that we can't even look at government or the political infrastructure, the political structure, for what is going wrong with in a society which is not a secular society. Why is Christianity the kicking post?
The whooping boy.
Yeah, the whipping boy, yeah. There has to be a reason for that we can put our finger on, and I really think that some of the loudest voices in Christianity are responsible for it, because if I had to adopt that kind of Christianity, there's no way I would do it.
Right.
I would think there's something desperately wrong with it.
Well,
and a part of that is so often the condemnation of other religions, that everybody who belongs to that religion, well, they're all going to hell after all, they're not us. And of course, then there's a reaction to that.
Yeah, and I would agree that there is that sense. I was just telling you earlier about a former colleague of mine who is dealing with exploited young women who are sexually exploited, and how a particular young woman she was talking about becomes the condemned in certain church circles that she's been in, and she's quit going to church because of that. Whereas she knows that this young woman, was sexually abused, is continually being exploited, and even though she's going along with it to some degree, she's not old enough to be making certain decisions. But I think one of the things that I also have experienced and seen is that it's almost this marriage of what you say about how sometimes Christianity has been portrayed and lived out by certain people within certain church environments and such. And then marrying that up with people's egoism and their pride and their desire to live their own way and to find someone to blame and to rebel against God, when you put that marriage together, then you see people not even seeking out God himself.
Yeah, that's an issue. I remember as a very young deacon, I was sent to Alaska, and I had a family that one of the boys and his wife were close friends of mine. I used to go to their house, and everybody called his sister a whore and a slut. And one day she was in a fight with the younger brother. And the younger brother called her a slut, and she said, well, what the hell did you expect of me after what all you guys did to me when I was 8 years old? So when a girl has been raped and sexually abused, it's not a matter of, well, she should make a choice. It's a matter that her spirit's been broken. Something in her humanity's been crushed. And those decisions are beyond her capacity anymore. And if we are fulfilling the role of real Christians, we're there to try to help heal her, not to condemn and judge her. But this is the whole point. Moralism has superseded morality. And that's one of the big problems. Sin is not the problem. And I have to say that from an Orthodox point of view. Sin is not the problem. The problem is alienation. It is not sin. Sin is a result of alienation. But the idea that sin, he's a sinner, that is so much a part of the Christianity that most people see and hear, that it really is a part of the problem. And it's up to those of us who are speaking for it to try to change or alter that a little bit and to make it more broad and open. And what does happen sometimes in society, there's an infudation of what's true morality. And again, I'll go back to the foundation rock upon which all morality is based is evolutionary, it's not religious. And it comes from group selection. And it's the concept of fairness and the concept of empathy.
Now, if I could just add here.
Sometimes they'll supersede the moralism. And then Christians are hysterical, or religious people are hysterical because they think society has become immoral because it goes back to the roots of morality, instead of all the laws, rules, and regulations we pile on top of it. That's a problem.
Yeah, if I can just maybe add here as we wind this down, is that I think secularism can be broken into three areas. Yeah. One is a form of secularism emerges as a result of, on the one hand, Christians being very militant in terms of turning on one another, either denominationally or in wars. And so secularism is an attempt to distance politics and the state from religion because of its negative side. That's one element, and it's a practical decision just because of the implications. At a theological level, a military and a political level. There's also a form of secularism that just argues from a certain view of evolution, and there's different views of evolution, that we're growing away from religion and away from spirituality. We're shapers of our own future, and we don't need religion anymore. There's been a couple of good, one good program on CBC just recently, The Myth of the Secular by David Cayley, a 6-part series, and then Charles Taylor, one of our great philosophers, did The Secular Age. And so there's other forms of secularism that just basically says, of course religion will continue, it's not going to go away, but it should be privatized. It's what you do in your synagogues, your church, your mosques, your gurdwara, your temples, you name it. And then there's another form, which I think is a healthy form of secularism, that is willing to entertain and draw into the larger political sphere the sacred also, but do so in a way that honors and respects different traditions and doesn't demean one tradition and elevate or romanticize another. And so when people talk about secularism and the sacred, it's very important to know what type of secularism they're talking about in that process, because you'll often get people have a simple or a simplistic understanding. And secularism is a very nuanced term, both historically and in the present tense. And when we grapple with this sacred secular discussion, both can have negative connotations, both can have positive, and it's the best of both sides that need to be brought together for healthy citizenship and society and state and the world that we live in.
Yeah, and the fact that we're kind of running out of time, but we three rarely use. Neither a candlestick maker, a butcher, or a baker. But in any case, it's great for us to get together and discuss these things and to open up about them a bit and try to look at what the problem is. We are a spiritual society, and we'll continue to be a spiritual society. We're not going to become a secular society. But it's the direction that takes and how we can do that with peaceful coexistence among various religions, where through most of our history we've been fighting against each other. That's one of the issues. If we can do that, then we can advance Christianity as well, I think. Did he come?